Realism is a word that signifies so much. But what does it mean? Whereas art history is fond of regrouping artists into intelligible movements, works of art and their disobedient nature resist such classification. With this in mind, we might ask, is there a way of mapping 19th century realism? A rough definition of the term that can be seen by looking at the history of realism from antiquity to the present day. By doing this, maybe we will be able to identify what realism means. Let's try. So we will start this first part by mapping realism in art history. I'll begin with Roman portraiture, which was, on the whole, realist. This means that the physiognomic features of an older person can be recognised, a characteristic unthinkable in earlier Greek statuary, which used idealised facial features instead. Next, we'll move on to the Italian Renaissance, where painting was more obviously realistic. If you look carefully, you can see that this part, for example, is painted in perfect illusion, reproducing columns with a trompe l'oeil effect, which was produced thanks to the invention of perspective. Following soon after the Italian Renaissance was Michelangelo Caravaggio, who was not always appreciated for his excessive realism. In particular, the supposedly dirty feet he painted. This was partly because he wasn't very respectful of pilgrims, but being a realist that he was, they could hardly have been depicted in slippers. Skipping forward in time, we get to Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who wasn't actually considered a realist painter by his peers. Despite this, his work was close to reality. Here we can see a verruca, a heavy jowl, and a double chin. So we've moved from century to century, whilst all the time speaking of realism. And what we have seen is that isms are in many instances a one-size-fits-all model, such that when we say realism, we are not actually saying much at all. If we turn to Naum Gabot, who published his realistic manifesto in 1920, we can see a very different type of realism. But in the collectively understood terms of realism, such a categorization is hardly self-evident. It might be easier to consider this work rather abstract. Next, let's look at the exhibit The Art of the Real that took place in 1968. We can also query this notion of the real, in which a pile of wood was meant to be the art of the real. Lastly, in France, there were the New Realists. Here is a work by Daniel Spoeri. How did he approach realism? He took a tabletop and stuck plates on it. And as we know, paintings are normally hung. So he hung the tabletop to the wall, and thus created an outstanding work of New Realism. Aside from their ism label, we can ask, do these so-called realist works have anything in common with the father of 19th century realism, Gustave Courbet? For realism's battle really began in 1851 with Courbet's work, which was a scandal. But if we search for photographic realism within this corpus, which was much appreciated at the time, we will be disappointed. For example, if we look at these faces, we can see that they are not very sharp, while other painters from the same time produced works with a proficient and defined technique. So this ism in realism, what is it referring to specifically? To examine this question further, we must turn to the literature realism relates to. For when one thinks of realism in the arts, both Courbet and Jules Champfleury are called to mind. Courbet the painter and Champfleury the author and critic, who wrote the essay titled Realism. Here are a few extracts from their prose, where we might find some clues. First, Courbet's Realist Manifesto, which was the foreword to the brochure accompanying his 1855 exhibition. The exhibition was a one-man show, which was held after some of his works had been refused by the Salon. We don't know the official statistics, but assuming he presented 11 or 12 works, at least 2 or 3 were refused. This offended Courbet, and he opened his own space known as the Pavilion of Realism, where he could show all of his works. He had proclaimed that the title of realist was thrust upon me, and apparently he didn't recognise the title. He goes on to declare that titles have never given a true idea of things, and, if it were otherwise, the works would be unnecessary. Therefore, the title of realist was imposed upon him. Here we agree that, without expanding on the greater or lesser accuracy of the name, which nobody, I should hope, can really be expected to understand. Nevertheless, we are going to try and understand what realism means, although our first attempt has failed. Maybe we'll be luckier with Champfleury, as realism's main theoretician, who presented his ideas in an 1855 letter to George Sand, known as On Realism, and published Le Realism 2 years later. Here is an extract. Mr. Courbet is a realist. I am a realist. Since the critics are saying it, I let them say it. Notice how he doesn't seem to have chosen the term himself. But to my great shame, I confess that I have never studied the code containing the rules by which the newcomer is permitted to produce realist works. So Champfleury didn't know what the code was. Our work is going to be tough. Yet the omnipresence of the term realist requires we take on the challenge. Champfleury added that, in a letter to his friend Max Bucon, as to realism, consider the word one of the biggest jokes of our time. This may have been amusing to Bucon. However, it frustrates our objectives. To draw the outlines of realism, to see whereabouts it is situated, what its objectives are and how it worked. But knowing that its codes didn't exist at the time rather complicates the matter. For Charles Baudelaire, who wasn't a realist, although that depends on what you call reality, because according to him, reality was shaped by the imagination. After his visit to the 1855 Salon, Baudelaire devised a project to write a text titled, Since Realism Exists. If there is a realism, let's begin with this. The text itself remains a draft, but it's worth looking at. Question: do we have access to the realm of reality? To answer this question, we first need to analyse the relationship between reality and realism, and we'll start with the enemies of realism, for whom reality is seen as an inaccessible realm. According to Plato, reality is an ideal world. It is inaccessible to the layman, who only sees a world of shadows, the realm of the senses that 19th century realists confuse with reality. This mug in front of me might seem very obviously real to you, but according to Plato and the Structuralists, we never truly access reality. According to Plato, our mug isn't real, since it is merely a reflection of an ideal form. Humanity, for Plato, lives as if it were in a cave. You might remember Plato's allegory of the cave, described in Book 7 of his Republic. According to Plato, humankind lives in a cave, and everything they see and consider to be real is but a reflection against a wall of objects, themselves artificial reproductions of real objects. The real objects, known as truths, are outside the cave, and to access the realm of the real and of beauty, both with a capital R and a capital B, one has to be taught philosophy and question the obvious. This is also the reason that Plato didn't like painters very much. We like holding Plato to his provocation that artists need to be chased out of the city. I'll briefly explain the origin of this statement. Plato didn't use a mug, as I have, but used a bed. This mug, or bed, is not real, but a deceiving reflection. So if a very talented painter mimetically reproduces it, Plato refers to art as mimesis. He deceives us one step further. He leads us further from truth. Truth exists in a realm far away, just as the ideal mug lies outside my cave. This is the mug from the tangible world, and is therefore already false. It is but a shadow, a reflection, a copy of the real world. So this painting is one step above it in deceit. 2 echelons from reality, which for Plato is a catastrophe. The more realistic a painting is in style, the further we are taken from the realm of the real without ever realising the deception. With this in mind, we maybe can understand why works such as this one, exhibited at MoMA in 1968, were displayed under the title The Art of the Real. In the foreword, more precisely during the press conference that took place on the eve of the exhibition, it was said that this art of the real, however, does not strive to be realistic, i.e., like the real, but to be as real in itself. So, finally, people had achieved a level of critical understanding. You want pieces of wood? We'll give you pieces of wood. And with the nouveau realists, rather than painting plates, we'll give you real plates. From Plato's point of view, we are closer to reality than with a mimetic painting, as a level of reflectivity remains. Maybe you're thinking, but Plato wrote so long ago. Yes, he did. But Christian tradition assimilated his ideas, and his theories were transmitted via a 16th century theologian called Sebastian Franck. Franck wrote that God kept the truth to himself, merely leaving appearances for us in a secondary world, whereas the real world stayed with him in heaven. In this way, Platonian theories were transmitted and retained in the Christian tradition, a tradition which has influenced our own modern mentalities. The German philosopher George Hegel considered art to be a vehicle between the realm of the senses and the realm of truth. Art, according to Hegel, should be able to bring forth a realm of true ideas, but with one condition, that it respects the grand style, that is to say, the academic style, certainly not the realist one, which would be wasted on painting. So for Plato, for Christians, for academic tradition, and for Hegel, there is no direct human access to truth. Instead, philosophy, religion, and art lead people to an approximate truth. So, for instance, the grand academic style we mentioned before was conceived to be able to transcend societal events and access a notion of real beauty. Set against this tradition was 19th century realism, which embraced first-hand reality as the painters saw it. It no longer believed in transcendence. It didn't aspire to an ideal world. Its world was simply here. A worker in a field was reality, and a reality worthy of being painted just as it was. Let's move on to another generation of intellectuals for whom reality is not tangible as an accessible unity. Reality is an inaccessible world, if it even exists at all. We only have access to language that in itself refers back to other languages, but never leads to the desired tangible reality. Our universe is made of signs that hark back to other signs. Consequently, the structuralists are, for many an art history or literature student, a bête noire. Jacques Derrida had even been considered an intellectual terrorist. But actually, structuralism is rather useful. I'm going to attempt to present these thinkers by simplifying their jargon as best as possible, even if, sometimes, it means caricaturing them. And for that, I'm sorry. Ferdinand de Saussure was Swiss. At the start of the century, he taught linguistics at university, where he created the famous Saussure course. There are two important elements from his teaching that are worth looking at. The first is the arbitrary character of the relationship between signifier and the signified. The signified, for instance, is a real horse, the one that gallops through the fields. We also have words and signifiers as tools that allow us to refer to the so-called signified. Cheval in French, Pferd in German, horse in English, caballo in Spanish, and so on. It becomes apparent that from one language to the other, words or signifiers change, which means that there's no umbilical cord or titanium rope that links the word horse to the thing horse. Therefore, the relationship between signifier and signified is an arbitrary and fluctuating one. As we can see, language has no fixed relationship to anything. To take a few examples. In England, if you want to order sheep or lamb and say, sheep please, they might well bring you a live sheep. If you want cooked sheep, you have to order lamb or mutton. It's the same in Spanish, with pez and pescado. Though the perfect example, I think, is la bruja, or witch. In Southern America, people respectfully call their wives bruja. But try and call your wife a witch in the UK and it will not go down well at all. So you see, the same word is ultimately never attached to the same thing in another language. Indeed, the relationship between signifier and signified is arbitrary. The second important point is how Saussure said that words never exist in positivity, meaning that they don't exist on their own. It is not because I say daytime that one understands the concept of daytime. We understand it through opposition to other words, to other concepts. If I say daytime, you understand that it isn't nighttime. If I say modern, and this is precisely Saussure's example, a modern lamp means not an old lamp. We don't know exactly what a word in itself means, but we know full well what it doesn't mean. Therefore, if I say future or tomorrow, you think not past and not yesterday. Clearly, we function in opposition, and actually, the more we try to talk, the more we wander from word to word. It's what Derrida called différence. We differentiate words and their meaning by journeying from one word to another. Is a high-speed chase that bounces from word to word, that attempts but never succeeds in seizing ideas and truths. That's how you enter infernal intertextuality, as the structuralists call it. Let's begin by simplifying intertextuality. Here you have the word horse, which might make you think of treks, Zorro or gauchos. Or you might be contemplating horse riding, equestrian competitions and polo, but you could also be thinking about Hollywood and cowboys. According to structuralists, Every time you say a word, that word isn't necessarily linked to the thing itself, but rather to other words in a mass of related meanings. That's why we end up often stuck in a web of words. We can even think of them literally as spider webs because they are sticky and the text is salient, while others speak of arborescence and constellations. But in all cases, words refer to a broader intertextual idea. But let's return to the case at hand. We are prisoners of language, and since we don't have access to the real, the actual mug, we only have access to the word mug and its associations. We are all subjectified, or maybe worse, fragmented, and indeed each theoretician has their own version of the subjection that occurs when a baby is born. There is the Lacanian version, Bartz's and Christeva's. My explanation will be sufficiently broad so as to cover each of them. At birth, the baby might be themselves. They are allegedly in reality and possibly possess an innate essence. Imagine this baby is a hard drive before being formatted, when no information has been downloaded. After this stage comes the training, something akin to uploading formatting, beginning with cultural, linguistic, and gestural data. Those who know multiple languages are aware that every time you switch from one to the other, you take on a new identity, because through language one immerses oneself in a culture that in turn articulates them. With similar care, you could say my dear wife in English and la bruja in Spanish, but certainly not my dear witch in English. Identities change with language. When the child learns its first language, there is an imposed grammar, syntax, and often Cartesian logic. When it comes to French, a whole culture comes with it, with centuries of sedimentation. Afterwards, the child is cleaved. They are partly formatted by this language, but also by other languages. Insomuch as identity grows out of successive fragmentations of the subject. Each part of the body, each part of the being, is subjected to exogenous discipline or form of discourse. We call discourses or texts different types of language, whether gesture, speech, or writing. It's all very broad. Let's continue. It isn't simply that a Cartesian and stable I speak a language. It's that the language inhabits me. This is fundamental. Language, as Lacan put it, is the place of otherness, so that languages, othernesses, constitute my identity, hence the fragmentation and subjection of the self. Julia Kristeva, a key figure of the Structuralist group, wrote an extraordinary book called Strangers to Ourselves. As she came originally from Eastern Europe, she had directly experienced the estrangement of speaking a foreign language. She strongly felt how identities could be modified, alienated, fragmented by languages. So let's summarise the Structuralists and the whole postmodern generation. From the 60s onwards, much of academic theory was dominated by the fragmented subject and the subjected self. This self was incapable of capturing reality, which remained inaccessible. The 19th century generation of thinkers was, on the contrary, keen to believe that they could access it. And this will be the subject of our next chapter.